Okay, I didn't finish the other night, I never do. We're going to talk about the Zapruder film chain of custody problems for 30 minutes. I'm going to tell you all about how the Zapruder film was not where we thought it was for years. It was not in Chicago the weekend of the assassination. It was in the hands of the CIA and the Secret Service, shuttling between Washington, D.C. and Kodak headquarters in Rochester, New York. Now, there are reasons to challenge the ZFilm's authenticity, several reasons, and here we go. There are omissions, note events that many witnesses saw in Dealey Plaza excluded from the film. There are other image frames that are, in the opinion of me and my fellow researchers from California, clearly altered. The chain of custody is not all what it was represented to be for years, and proves there was a high level of interest in the film by the federal government the weekend of the assassination. If you buy David Rohn's book from 2003 about the Zapruder film, you will read him say, you will read in his book where he says the federal government had no interest in the Zapruder film the weekend of the assassination, and that they had no capability to alter it. He's dead wrong, okay? All the research now has proven that to be wrong. So the chain of custody problems are the irregularities in the chain of custody, which I will describe to you shortly. The two NPIC events. NPIC is the National Photographic Interpretation Center in the Navy Yard in Washington, D.C. The film was there that weekend twice. It was there Saturday night and all night long until Sunday morning at 3 a.m., and then it left. It came back Sunday night, late Sunday night, 24 hours later, and was there all Sunday night and into Monday morning. And we'll be talking about what I think happened. And the CIA withheld key information about the film's handling and processing from both the Rockefeller Commission and one of its own key employees. We know this whole story now. Now, I'm convinced the true exit wound in JFK's head in the right rear quadrant has been crudely blacked out. My friends in California, Sidney Wilkinson and Tom Whitehead, are in the midst of making a serious documentary. It's about half completed. We hope it's completed by a year from this November. I've been overly optimistic in the past on predicting when it will be finished, but it will be finished. And when it's finished, it will change the way the world views the Zapruder film. A massive paradigm shift will take place, even among those, I predict, who are still skeptics. When you get to see the images yourself on a Blu-ray DVD in a little over a year, and hopefully broadcast on some network, you will not view the Zapruder film the same again. You will realize then that it is not the ground truth of the assassination, that it's an altered film which was designed to hide things from us and which misrepresents itself as ground truth in the assassination. This is a busy slide. I'm going to keep going. You can look at this on the DVD later. The wound in the top of the head in the Z-film, I don't believe it. I think it's artwork. The true exit wound in the right rear has been blacked out. And in these new digital scans of the Z-film, you will clearly see that about a year from now. There's a crude representation in my book, but it doesn't do justice to the digital scans in 6K resolution. Now let's look at the other indicators of the film's likely alteration. The turn from Houston to Elm, which Zapruder claims he filmed and his secretary claims he filmed, is not in the film. But there's a massive jump cut at frame 132 from a bunch of motorcycle cops that were in the lead to suddenly the limousine just magically appears on Elm Street. And there's no first frame overexposure at that frame like there should be. So I think the turn has been excised, optically excised, cut out. Many people in Dealey Plaza, most of you know who they are, saw exit debris traveling to the rear and to the left rear of the president after he was shot in the head. You don't see that on the film. That should trouble people. And of course, Bobby Hargis, to the left rear of the car, was hit with debris with such force that he thought he had been shot. And both he and Cheney's at the right rear of the limousine, they were both covered with gore, blood and brain tissue, when they were observed later at Parkland Hospital by their supervisor, Stavis Ellis, motorcycle cop Stavis Ellis. I believe that the rapidity and the force of the back and to the left motion of President Kennedy's body in the film has been artificially speeded up by frame excision. I believe the people who altered the film had to take out the exit debris frames because it was clear evidence of shots from the front. In doing so, they've speeded up the motion of his body. I believe that motion happened, but I don't believe it happened that fast and that forcefully. I think it was an unintentional effect of alteration, which they found extremely unfortunate after they altered the film. And I think that's why the film was suppressed as a motion picture for 12 years. Remember, Life magazine repurchased the film on Monday. Okay. I have the first contract quoted in my book, verbatim, and it says $50,000 for print rights. And I have the second contract quoted verbatim in my book, and it says $150,000 on Monday. And it's worldwide motion picture rights and print rights and possession of all the copies and the original. And of course, it was never licensed as a motion picture after they paid more money to get those rights. So that's my opinion of why it was suppressed as a motion picture. Because the motion of Kennedy's body implied a shot from the front, and they said, oh, we can't show this to people. Okay, over 50 witnesses claim the motorcade stopped, that the limousine stopped during the shooting for a brief period of time, and you don't see that in the film. So let's keep moving. I'm going to place a sound bite for you. This has been in front of us for years, and there we go. Now I'm having trouble with this. Here we go. This is a 2-minute soundbite of Walter Cronkite on national television on the day of the assassination, and Bob Clark of ABC News on television the day of the assassination.
Let us recount this incident again. There has been an assassination attempt against the life of President John F. Kennedy in Dallas, Texas. The President, Mrs. Kennedy, and Governor Connally of Texas, en route from the Dallas airport to a speech the President was scheduled to make at noon in Dallas, were in the President's famed bubble-top car, driving through cheering crowds in the streets of Dallas when 3 shots rang out. The President slumped into the lap of Mrs. Kennedy, apparently a bullet wound in his head. Governor Connally slumped to the floor of the car. Bullet wounds were seen in his chest. Mrs. Kennedy screamed out, "Oh no!" The car stopped momentarily. Secret Service men unloaded their rifles and started into the crowd. 2 persons, a man and a woman, were seen crouched with a crowd around them on a hilltop overlooking the road. Whether they were concerned in the shooting or not, we do not know yet. Secret Service men rushed to that scene, and we're waiting a report on that.
Now, the next man, Bob Clark, was in the motorcade in an open car. He observed what he's describing.
Almost inconceivable at that stage that this was an assassination. About no more than 2 or 3 seconds elapsed before the car that the President was traveling. This was an open limousine that had been sent out from the White House fleet in Washington. This car came to an immediate stop. The Secret Service follow car. Some of the agents piled out, then almost immediately leaped back in. We saw one of them pull out a submachine gun. They leaped back into the car, and the motorcade took off very rapidly. It had just entered a throughway.
Okay, so Bob Clark was in one of the open press cars, just a few cars back, and he said the car came to an immediate stop. He's describing what he saw. Cronkite was describing what he got on the phone from veteran reporters. But Clark is describing what he saw. It should trouble you that you don't see that in the Zapruder film. There's other new evidence coming out now. Fred Newcomb's interviews from 1971 with motorcycle cops, which I just got a week ago from another researcher named Larry Rivera, who's doing great work with that audio. He's producing transcripts. These are quotes. Bobby Hargis to the left rear of the car. The driver almost stopped the car. The limo stopped 3 to 4 seconds, maybe 5 to 6 seconds. It was a rolling stop, less than 1 mile an hour. For all practical purposes, that's a car stop. Less than 1 mile per hour for up to 5 to 6 seconds. You don't see that in the Zapruder film. Cheney was to the right rear fender, at the right rear fender. But he says, I don't know if the lead car stopped, but I know Kennedy's car did because he says, I know I stopped. He's keeping station on the limousine. He stopped his bike. And look at that. Hargis on the left side jumped off his bike, ran between the two cars, and ran in front of Cheney, who had stopped his bike. I think the reason you don't see that on the Z film, it's just out of frame. It's just to the left. It's just out of the frame. But the point is, you're not going to run in front of the Queen Mary unless it has stopped. You don't want to get run over, do you? So if the Queen Mary stopped, it's because the limousine stopped. And if Hargis was willing to run in front of the big Queen Mary Cadillac convertible, then that means it stopped. These are from 1971 interviews. They're golden evidence. And then Stavis Ellis, you can read what it says. A piece of bone blew out the president's head. A kid picked it up, probably the son of Charles Brehm. That's my hypothesis. An agent jumped off the Queen Mary, took the bone out of his hand and threw it into the back of the limousine before it accelerated. You don't see that on the Zapruder film, and that means it had to stop long enough for that to happen. So I believe the 5 to 6 second, or maybe longer, car stop. This is very important, and even if I spend 5 minutes on this slide, it's very important that you understand this. There are 3 existing first-generation copies of the Z film right now. 2 of them are in the archives. They're called the Secret Service copies. One is at the 6th floor museum. They're so-called first-generation copies. I'm telling you, they're not the first-day copies developed Friday in Dallas. They cannot be. Here's the reasons why. The Jameson lab ran the 3 contact prints for Zapruder on Friday, the day of the assassination. His lab tech says we used full-frame aperture, picture plus soundtrack on the contact printer. That means that the 3 first-day copies they ran off on Friday would have had images between the sprocket holes, just as the so-called original does today. When you shoot at full telephoto in Dealey Plaza at that time of year at 12:30 in the afternoon, the image penetrates all the way to the left between the sprocket holes. And you can see that in many books today. That's the extant film in the archives, the so-called original. That should have been transferred to the 3 first-day copies. You don't see images between the sprocket holes in the 3 first-generation copies today. More importantly, the Jameson lab that ran the 3 first-day copies did not bracket the exposures. They used the same light pack for all 3 copies. The 3 first-generation copies that exist today are clearly bracketed films. Bracketed. One is perfect exposure, one's a little bit too light and washed out, one is too dark. Now, Raleigh Zavada has examined them, the Kodak consultant to the review board. I fully agree with his findings. He's published pictures of them in his addendum to the Zavada report. They are bracketed films, but that's not what was done the day of the assassination. So I'm telling you, just by studying the existing first-generation copies of the Zapruder film, you know it's an altered film. It's kind of coming at this from the back door. but it's very persuasive. I told you what NPIC is, National Photographic Interpretation Center. Most of what they did was U-2 photography and the early satellite photography, the Corona program. But they also did some human intelligence photography. The original camera, original 8mm, slit down to 8mm Zapruder film was delivered to them at 10 p.m. Saturday night, the day after the assassination. Their job is to make briefing boards. Blow up certain frames, make prints, paste them on a briefing board with some accompanying information so that officials can understand the assassination. There's nothing wrong with that activity. The problem is the film showed up again Sunday night. Briefing boards were made again. Whoever was in charge made sure that a completely different work crew was called in the second night. And they were told they could never discuss what they were doing with anyone. And they were told that if someone asked them about their overtime for that night, they were to refer them to Captain Sands. He was the deputy director of the facility. But they were not to tell anyone else what they had done. So I'm telling you a sanitized version of the Zapruder film, with the car stop removed, with the back of the head, the exit wound blacked out, with the top of the head monkeyed up to look like the autopsy photos, was delivered to the NPIC Sunday night. A sanitized set of briefing boards was made. What survives today is the sanitized briefing boards. The film in the archives that the American people paid $16 million for is an altered film. The archives made a forensic copy of it in 2002 or 2003, a film copy. They never digitized it like they said they would. They made a forensic copy. That's what you can buy a copy of today if you have $800. And they said, we're not taking it out of the freezer again. Well, we'll see about that. You wait about a year until this documentary is completed. We'll see about that. That's going to change. Let's keep moving. I don't have much time. As I've said, events 1 and 2 at NPIC used different personnel. Okay. Dino Brugioni, the chief information officer at NPIC, the right-hand man of the director, the co-founder of the place when it was set up in 1955, supervised event number 1 with, it had to be the original film, it's 8mm, right? The film brought Sunday night was no longer 8mm. It was 16mm wide. It was a double-8 film that had not yet been slit, as if it had just come out of the camera. Well, films don't just morph themselves from 8mm to back into a double-8 film that hasn't yet been slit, okay? So that film brought Sunday night was intended to mimic a camera original film, but it wasn't. Could not have been. The briefing boards made by Dino and his team Saturday night are missing. You cannot find them today. They were entirely different in character from the briefing boards made Sunday night, of which one set has survived. You can see the sanitized briefing boards in the archives in flat 90A in the JFK Records collection. So here's a summary of the differences. I'll just let you look at it briefly. It'll be on the DVD later. This is surviving briefing board panel 1. There's 4 panels. Panel 1, panel 2, panel 3, panel 4. By the way, there's 6 colored triangles on these boards, which imply 6 shots. Somebody thought there was 6 shots. Otherwise, I don't know what the triangles are. You notice there's 2 triangles in one frame. 313, that's interesting. This is Dino Brugioni. He insists he did not make the briefing boards that you can find today. The ones he made were joined by a hinge in the middle. There were only 2 panels joined by a hinge. He had 12 to 15 photos total, max. There's 28 photos on the 4 panels today. He says he did not make those. This is the really explosive news. The head explosion Dino Brugioni remembers was enormous, much bigger than the head explosion in the Zapruder film today. I'm going to play for you, and then later, he said that in April 2011. Later, when I interviewed him on video in July, He also said the head explosion he saw was white mist, a huge cloud of white mist with a massive piece of debris going straight up. He said it was not red and it was not pink. It was a huge white cloud. That's the brain fluid that supports your brain. It's a shock absorber. That's what that means. But it was a much bigger explosion than we see today. I'm going to play for you his first reaction in 2011 when Peter Janney showed him today's frame 313. This is his reaction. It's a long excerpt, but even if this is the last thing we have time for, it's worth listening to. So imagine frame 313. You all know what it looks like while you're listening to Dino react to it.
Okay. Extant film, Dino. This is the only frame where you have any indication of, his brains exploding.
Oh, it went into the air. I remember it went in the air.
Was it more than one frame? It would have to have been, wouldn't it?
Oh, yeah.
Huh?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. See, there's only one frame on the entire Zapruder film, frame 313, that gives any indication of that.
No, it was in the. I remember it was in the sky.
Yeah, but you see that's the only frame. It's just one frame. This now we go up to 635, 335, but let's go back to 313. Okay, that's the.
There's no 314.
Yeah, there is a 314, but it has none of this, pink haze, blood water.
No, I remember all of us being shocked.
And was it going out the back when you saw it?
It was going out front.
It was going out the front.
Going up.
Up. Okay. But was it leaving a trail in the rear?
No, it was straight up.
Uh-huh.
I remember.
But if that event took place, wouldn't you suspect to see it on more than one frame?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And because you're shooting, what, 18 frames per second? Isn't that what that camera did?
There should have been more than one frame.
Yeah, right. There should have been. Because here now is a picture.
There's no doubt in my mind, and I remember all of us being shocked because I thought the spray was say 3 or 4 feet from his head.
Uh-huh. Up in the air?
Yeah.
Uh-huh. Well, see, here we are again. I want to just have you look at this one more time. So
what I saw was more than that.
This is frame 313. So you saw more pink mist going up, straight up?
What I remember it was like right here, but high.
Uh-huh.
It wasn't low, it was high.
Uh-huh. Now, okay, so this is the only frame on the whole Zapruder film that you get to see.
No, there was more than that.
So you're saying there was more than one frame, for sure. How many frames do you think there would be?
I don't know, but all I know is that we were shocked when we saw it.
Right. For nearly 50 years.
Well, now they claim that if you go down to the archives, you ask for the Zapruder film, they claim that that's the true one?
That's the true one, right. The one the frames that we just looked at. No? You're shaking your head. That's not the true one, is it? Is that what you mean?
I say the one that I saw, man, his head, it was way high off of his head.
Yeah. The debris.
And I can't imagine that there would only be one frame.
Right. That's it. Right there.
Now, in 1975, the Rockefeller Commission was getting into the CIA's underwear. Tell us everything you've done with the Zapruder film, because a researcher, Paul Hoke, demanded to know. So, at the time, there was a new director at NPIC, Mr. Hicks. Dino went to him and said, I have this one remaining set of this 2-panel briefing board. We made 2 of them. One was for Mr. McCone, one was for the Secret Service. Mr. McCone sent his back to us years ago. I have it, it's locked up. He showed it to Mr. Hicks. Mr. Hicks exploded. He said, "What the hell are you doing with that? Get it the hell out of here." Dino sent it back to CIA Director Colby, and nobody has seen it since then. Hicks had found the existing 4-panel briefing boards. The existing briefing board set, which is 4 panels. He had found that. He told the Rockefeller Commission about that. He did not tell Dino Brugioni, his #1 briefing board expert, that he found a 4-panel briefing board set. He didn't tell Dino, he told the Rockefeller Commission. He did not tell the Rockefeller Commission that Dino had found a different set of boards. There's dishonesty going on here, okay? And then Hicks wrote a deceptive report, which you can read today in the Rockefeller Commission documents, conflating the 2 events. It's a worthless report. It conflates them together as if they were one event. They were not one event. Now, before we get into this, actually we don't have time, but when the second film was brought Sunday night for the new set of briefing boards, the Secret Service agent told the new set of workers, Homer McMahon and Ben Hunter, whom I interviewed a total of 6 times between them in 1997, he told them that it had come from Hawkeye Works, which was the code name for the CIA's, well, it was the code name the CIA used for Kodak's R&D lab in Rochester. He said it's come from Rochester. It was donated by an American who didn't want any money, who gave it to the government. That's a lie. He said it was just developed in Rochester. Well, it was just developed in Rochester, but it's not the original film. And Hawkeye Works was the worldwide #1 R&D plant for Kodak, which not only did U2 and Corona work for the CIA, but had optical printers, developed new movie film, did state-of-the-art research. So if you're going to alter a film, that's the place to do it. And that film was there from 12 to 14 hours on Sunday. The agents that brought it Saturday night left at 3 in the morning, Sunday morning. Didn't say where they were going. The film reappeared about 9 p.m. Sunday night again in a changed format, okay? But that's where it was all day Sunday, because the agent told Homer McMahon at the second event, this has come from Hawkeye Works. So this is the where and the when. And I'll finish this by saying that anyone who's read my book knows that there's a project going on in California. Sidney Wilkinson got a 35-millimeter dupe negative from the archives in 2008. It cost $800. That's not right, but that's what it cost. She had to get Gary Mack's permission before they would even let her buy the copy. That's not right. Before they produce their documentary and air it, they have to do a commercial license with, guess who? The 6th Floor Museum. That's not right. But hopefully in about a year, maybe a little more, that project will be finished. You'll all get to see these high-resolution scans, 6K state-of-the-art scans of each frame of the film. And you'll see the black patch on the back of the head very clearly, much more clearly than in the image in my book. So stay tuned, folks. This story is not over. The paradigm shift for the Zapruder film is just beginning.
That's curious. So the Warren Commission, which is trying to do all this stuff, like Jack Ruby's mother's teeth and all this irrelevant stuff they put in the volumes. Let's look at some of the things they did not put in the volumes. How about Lee Oswald's time cards from the Riley Coffee Company? They were collected by Warren DeBreeze, the FBI agent who winds up in Santo Domingo with David Atlee Phillips after the assassination. Okay? And he goes over there, collects the things, and he has his buddy, William Moynihan, former FBI agent, if there is such a thing, prepare a list. Okay? And in the Warren Commission volumes, they published the list, not the time cards. Why not? Well, anytime you talk about Lee Oswald and the Warren Commission in New Orleans, somebody says, oh yeah, there's that Barbie memo that our deposition or testimony or whatever it is, where Barbie says he's Lee Oswald's supervisor, and Lee was this terrible employee, and he was off campus when he was clocked in, and he could never get him to do any work, and he finally fired him. So I'm looking at this, and I said, well, Lee worked there from May 10th to, June 19th or whatever, and you were his supervisor. Why were you approving his time cards? The point is, he wasn't. William Moynihan was approving Lee's time cards, and when William was not around, his secretary was approving it, and his secretary is sitting in the back of the room. And she has this very distinctive J initial that she likes to use, and we now have the time cards, thanks to the JFK Records Act, and it's very clear. Any competent investigator would have looked at those time cards and said, whose initials are those? Let's get her in here. We've got some questions we want to ask her. Well, if you don't have the time cards, you don't have the initial, and you don't have the lead on Moynihan's secretary, who's working there as a cover job because she's really in town to do a cancer bioweapons project. Which is why none of this, including Clinton and Jackson, where they were testing the weapon, is in the Warren report. These guys knew about it, and here's how I'm going to attempt to show you that they really knew about it. I now have a memo from J. Edgar Hoover, written to the special agent in charge of the New Orleans office, telling his agents not to investigate the Mary Sherman murder. Well, why not? Well, it's local murder, jurisdiction. You remember I said her arm was burned off at the U.S. Public Health Service hospital? That's federal property. That's FBI jurisdiction. And when you drag her body back in a body bag and dump it in her apartment, you just changed the jurisdiction from FBI to NOPD. And now the head of the FBI is saying, we don't have to touch it, local murder. Okay? Nice work. But J. Edgar Hoover's signature, which I have on many documents, is not on this document because he was out of town and dictated it over the telephone. So he may not even have been aware of the note on page 2, which says, note, Mary Stoltz Sherman, 51, internationally renowned cancer researcher and surgeon, stabbed 7 or 8 times, right arm and rib cage missing, or burned away, actually is their word. Somebody's name was found in her address book. Oh, of course, that's where you put names, right? But why, where does this come from? The NOPD has contacted the FBI and says, tell the boss we found a name in her address book that he needs to know about. Well, the name is 6 letters long. Well, it could be Haslem, but maybe it's Oswald, okay? And whoever this name is so famous, they don't even have to use a first name. They're just using a last name. And I said, could this be, we have Victoria Hawes, who saw Lee in the patio apartments. We have Judith Very Baker, who was with Lee Oswald inside of Mary Sherman's apartment, and who says that Mary Sherman telephoned Lee on a number of occasions. Well, if she telephoned Lee Oswald, maybe she has Lee Oswald's name in her telephone book. Okay? This is tightening down quite nicely. And this should not be left to me, one man with a word processor, to speculate about. This is the knowledge. If we can prove that J. Edgar Hoover told his agents not to investigate the murder of a woman with Lee Oswald's name in her address book, we've got him. So I FOIA'd the FBI, and they said, I said, hey guys, I know you're busy, but we got JFK Records Act, Freedom of Information, and I only want one word out of a 50-year-old memo. They said, we're not telling you, appeal to the Department of Justice. So I appealed to the Department of Justice, and they said, essentially, in almost these words, we didn't have to tell Jeff Morley, and we don't have to tell you. Sue us. That was their response. So if anybody's ambitious enough to go sue the Department of Justice over this one word, let me know. I'll be happy to give you the file information. But sort of like what Greg was saying yesterday, you know, some of this is, you just got to step back and say, I get it, we're being lied to. Okay? Now, the coolest thing I heard yesterday was the guy who said, you know, if you're the only person in the room with a hammer, everybody else looks like a nail. Okay? That means we all bring our own perspective to this. Okay? And my perspective is, I did my graduate work in political science, and I did my career in advertising, marketing, positioning, branding, all those kind of things, okay? So as I look at this problem, I'm looking at it from those points of view. Well, let's talk about coup d'etats last night, since Cyril brought it up. And a coup d'etat is a sudden violent change in leadership of a state, usually from people within the structure. It's more like a mutiny than a rebellion. Okay, if it gets out of hand, you have a civil war. But the common tools are murder and exile. Now, that's the structure of it from a political science point of view. And what you find after the coup is these people just stole the government. They need to legitimize themselves. And they pulled together a big committee, okay, of important people to bless the coup. That is called a junta. And what I'm suggesting to you is we ought to start calling the so-called Warren report, it's really J. Edgar Hoover's report, what it really is. And it's a junta. It's a junta by any other name. And its role is not to investigate. I mean, I saw something 2 weeks ago in the press, so Atlantic Monthly or whatever they're calling it nowadays, talking about the Warren Commission investigation. There was no investigation. And I have on my website, on the blog there, I have a link to a YouTube interview it's a phone call between LBJ and J. Edgar Hoover discussing the formation of the Warren Report. And LBJ says, Edgar, I'd like to get by with one report on this, and I'd like that to be your report. Okay? And I'll pull together a blue ribbon panel to accept your report. Let me talk to you about who's going to be on the panel. So LBJ is getting Hoover's buy-off on who's going to be on the Warren Commission. And the first name he mentions is Allen Dulles, who Hoover agrees with right off the bat. Oh, fine, man, that would be great, okay? The purpose of the so-called Warren Report, I mean, the whole reason they call it the Warren Report is not to call it the Hoover Report, okay? They're trying, and this is legerdemain. Look left, you know, that idea was in somebody's presentation yesterday. This is the distraction. This is the real stuff. Okay, the real stuff here is Hoover decided an hour and a half after the assassination what the conclusion was. And now they're going to put this big blue ribbon circus together to bless it. And all this stuff.
You have 8 minutes.
8 minutes, okay, thank you. All this stuff was done, by the way, in Hale Boggs' congressional district in New Orleans. And Hale Boggs is on the Warren Report. And he's investigating the things going on in his own district, right? Including things involving Alton Oshner, who's been doing secret projects for the federal government for 40 years. There's one other thing I want to touch on. There's a name in Lee Oswald's phone book. It's Kloepfer, okay, Dr. Werner Kloepfer. He's a geneticist, works at Tulane University, writes some papers with Mary Sherman's good friend Carolyn Talley. Speaks fluent German because he was raised on a farm in Ohio with German grandparents. And the Warren Commission interviewed Dr. Kloepfer's wife, but did not interview Dr. Kloepfer. Why not? Was Kloepfer part of stuff they didn't want to talk about? Is it the same reason they didn't get into Clinton and Jackson? Because they all knew about the biological weapons project? Because it was a secret federal government project? Well, one of the questions I get all the time is, Ed, do you really think the CIA was behind this thing going on in New Orleans? I said, well, you know, that question would be easier to answer if the CIA was willing to tell us what they did. And right after my book came out in 2007, General Michael Hayden, who was the director of the CIA at the time, decided to hold this big press conference, open the kimono, and tell everybody all the stuff the CIA did, present the family jewels, as they call it. Well, there they are, all 8 of them, and you can read 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. Jewel number 1, which happened between 1958 and 1964, is 100% redacted. 3 pages of text. They will not tell you an if, and, or but. Nothing. 50 years later, there's something they did right at the time frame of Dr. Mary's monkey that they are unwilling to tell the American people a single word about. Okay, so this all leads me to the conclusion that we've been lied to with great conviction, and those lies will likely to continue. And we just got sort of as I think it was Greg was saying yesterday, we got to stop thinking about think about the detail because it doesn't match up, but also step back and look at the bigger picture that you can't expect stuff that they're not going to give us, okay? And we just have to make our own conclusions and go on from there. That's all I have to say. I'm taking questions.
Thank you very much, and thanks to you, Mr. Denton, and the boys for sponsoring this. I really do appreciate the opportunity. This is the story of how a boy aged 12 from the hill country of Texas declared his candidacy for the President of the United States in 1920. Essentially, I mean, he was telling his little friends that he was going to be president someday, but he meant it. And he pursued that vigorously from then on. I mean, it was for him an obsession. Lyndon Johnson was different from the other kids, though. He was really a boy who was born with some psychological or psychiatric issues that I'm going to be getting into. I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm not a psychologist. Never had the desire to be, to tell you the truth. However, you can't escape the fact that it's there, and that's what we're going to be showing you in the first part of the first half, just to establish that as beyond beyond doubt. But he was different in every other way possible. He was bigger than the other children, and he was very obsessed with different things to prove his own self-worth, and therefore became a high school bully by the time he was in high school. And then all of that really stuck with him for the rest of his life. That's the way he operated throughout his life, even in the Oval Office, as we shall see. But I've always been struck by the bizarre, extraordinary dichotomy of the American public paying homage to a president portrayed as one of the 10 or 15 best leaders of the country, in spite of the fact that in reality, he was in fact the epitome of a disgraceful criminal. That is the result of a set of myths created originally by Johnson himself, then perpetuated by the government through purchasing influential voices in the media to hide the secrets of the assassination and Johnson's presidency, and clearly Lyndon Johnson himself. Recall that the basic premise of my first book was that only a presentation made in the style of an aggressive prosecutor presenting his or her case to a jury would be effective in making the case against Lyndon Johnson. Another ho-hum biography without a coherent and critical analysis of the interconnections of Johnson's demonstrated history of behavior could not have accomplished the transformative reinterpretation of real history, still hidden from the record presented in contemporary textbooks of a president still revered by many, if not most of the population. It was something that had to be done, I felt, to reconcile factual history with the sanitized versions that are the norm. And I think you can understand what I'm talking about. Some of the biographies on Lyndon Johnson border on the obsequious. They are just the ones by Jack Valenti, for example, and Horace Busby and others, Doris Kearns Goodwin. The combined evidence within these books demonstrate a continuum existed in the before and after conspiracies. One single example of that, it was the existence of fake Secret Service agents in Dealey Plaza, as several witnesses reported, to collect cameras and film immediately after the assassination, and to stop people from getting too close to the action behind the fence beforehand. One of these men was apparently Bernard Barker, AKA Macho Man of Watergate fame, identified later by Detective Seymour Weitzman, as well as eyewitness Malcolm Summers. You may recall Seymour Weitzman was one of the two men who found the rifle and claimed initially that it was not, the question of Mannlicher Carcano never came up. They simply declared it to be a Mauser, a 7.65 Mauser. And there was no doubt about it because three people, one of whom, Weitzman, operated a sporting goods store. He knew guns backwards and forwards. He wouldn't have made that mistake, especially because they read right off the gun itself, Mauser. Yet they were all pressured. They were all pressured to change that and say that they were confused when they did that, and to say that it was really a Mannlicher Carcano. Well, the only person who didn't do that was Roger Craig. And Roger Craig, stood on principle, and he wasn't going to lie. And even though he was almost forced to lie by his own superiors in the Dallas County Sheriff, Bill Decker is who I'm talking about, he refused to, and he stuck with that story. Anyway, the cumulative existence, or cumulative evidence, leads inexorably to a logical presumption that Lyndon Johnson's known actions to cover up the real story after the assassination, viewed by many, since that is exactly how he intentionally portrayed it, as merely his attempt to avoid World War III, were intrinsically connected to the before plotting and planning. It is this continuum that shows the pre- and post-conspiracies were not separate, unconnected. There was only one conspiracy, and the shooting of JFK was merely the halftime intermission that marked the switch of most of the first half actors, e.g. Angleton, Harvey, DeMornshield, Oswald, with the second half actors, e.g. Hoover, Dulles, Specter, and the rest. There was really only one prominent actor in both halves. That was Lyndon B. Johnson, although Allen Dulles did, admittedly, appear in both. You all know about the big debate my book has produced among JFK researchers. Some regard LBJ as a mere puppet of the invisible government. But I believe that Lyndon Johnson was a key player, the one who conceived a strategy in 1958, or even before. Some folks, many in fact, believe the term mastermind is a stretch, to put it mildly. In my opinion, it comes down to semantics. What is the meaning? What's the meaning of mastermind? The dictionary meaning. In all three cases, I'm not going to read all this, but one dictionary says that a person who originates or is primarily responsible for the execution of a particular idea, project, or the like would be a mastermind. Merriam-Webster says, a person who supplies the directing or creative intelligence for a project fits the definition. Oxford Dictionary says someone who plans and directs an ingenious and complex scheme or enterprise. But nowhere there do you see anything about how a mastermind would have to know every detail regarding a plan involving numerous others. Yet according to some of my critics, that is what they think the term means. By these definitions, a person who merely furnishes the germ of an idea and then walks away from it can still be considered the mastermind. So all this debate, to me, is going nowhere, especially when you consider that my second book also has that term still in it, and I did not pull it. So I say to you, name me one other suspect who had the manipulative powers of LBJ. But hold that until we get through at least the first part of this presentation. There is one single premise that must be understood in order to understand what happened in Dealey Plaza. A key element of any organization, especially an ad hoc group intent on a high-risk and dangerous assignment, is forceful leadership. Someone had to become the driving force, a singular nucleus of a driving force to provide the momentum to pull it off. The alternative is assassination by committee, by an amorphous group of anonymous men who run an invisible government. And by the way, if you want to go that way, then of course we're going to leave it right at the door up in Langley, and that's where it's going to sit forever, because you'll never get it out of there. Anyway, we'll go back to the script here. No one representing just one of these power bases could have possibly pulled off the crime of the century. It had to be a man solidly connected to each and every one of them. Who else had the connections he had developed for about 30 years into every facet of the military-industrial congressional complex? He was the de facto leader of the Texas group, Suite 8F, I refer to. He was part of the Georgetown group, as well as James Rowley, Secret Service, and J. Edgar Hoover, FBI. He had all of these people were in his orbit constantly, and he was constantly massaging them and keeping things going, as well as the Eastern establishment, Nelson Rockefeller, John McCone. They were all buddies of his, and he had back channels to the CIA through Dulles, Angleton, Helms, etc., and the Pentagon, Howard Burris primarily, LeMay, Lansdale, etc., which kept him more informed than JFK was as to what was really happening in such places as Vietnam, Cuba, and Berlin. Let's not leave out his long-term associations with the mafia through Carlos Marcello, primarily, and through Bobby Baker, numerous others. There was no one better qualified to influence the military-industrial complex, the CIA, the mafia, all of them, in 1961 and 63, than Lyndon B. Johnson. And not to put too fine a point on it, but you could probably correctly call him the CEO of that invisible government. Speaking of LBJ and Hoover, can you say major long-term dose of Johnson treatment? Envision Johnson, 6'4", towering over Hoover, 5'10", on his back patio in Northwest Washington, as he did in that center photo with Abe Fortas. As he rendered the Johnson treatment to Hoover often during their 20-year period when they were neighbors, in keeping with the routine he used with those he administered it to, he would no doubt stoke Hoover's anger and stroke him physically. It would not be out of character for him to even kiss his forehead, as he did Sam Rayburn, with his arm around him, making provocative comments like, that SOB Kennedy. He is running this country, and we have a patriotic duty to stop him. If we don't, who will? This is after 3 or 4 scotches, of course. And speaking further of Johnson's neighbor, Hoover, Hoover already lived in that house when Lady Bird and Lyndon decided to buy a house across the street and 2 doors down. That's how far it was. You could throw a baseball over there. Even he could throw a baseball. Even Hoover could probably. And I want to leave you with these 2 quotes here that I found somewhere, attributed to J. Edgar Hoover. The individual is handicapped by coming face to face with a conspiracy so monstrous they cannot believe it exists. The American mind simply has not come to the realization of the evil which has been introduced into our midst. Of course, now he was talking about communism, but that same description could apply to other things. It's awfully warm up here. And the second one, justice is incidental to law and order. I didn't know I had to look at that for a while, but there's something wrong with that sentence, in my humble opinion, by the way. A lot of this is my humble opinion, and I understand how, I'm not trying to be forceful in terms of everybody's got to agree with it or not, but this is the way I believe things went down. I'm going to do a reading from chapter 2 of my new book. Allen Dulles was a man without office. He was also a man unfamiliar with the concept that Lyndon Johnson knew so well. Power is where power goes. Dulles would have considered that to be an abstract and esoteric notion, whereas for Johnson, it would have been a daily mantra, intrinsic to his every thought. The dilemma, in my view, comes down to which of them had the power to manipulate a few dozen people across the governmental bureaucracy, all of whom were essential to the plot's success. The driving force, the term I use, that united not only the key individuals within the intelligence and military communities, but just as importantly, the other key players throughout the federal bureaucracy, as well as the Dallas officials who had to be brought into the planning and execution, as well as officials at the state level of law enforcement and judicial powers within Texas. Maybe I can read this better with my glasses. There was really only one man who could also guarantee the promise of lifetime protection. Never mind that for some, that period would be much shorter than it might otherwise have been. And that person, by definition, was a man who was driven by reckless ambition, by reckless abandon, with enormous charisma that could be turned on and off on demand. A person whose skills of people manipulation were incomparable to any other person, the kind who still played king of the mountain and would indeed crown himself king of the world in due course. What I'm referring to there comes out of a book called The Flying White House by Ralph Albertazzi, who described a point in 1965 where Johnson was flying in Air Force One high above his domain. His domain being as president, he was referring to the United States. However, Johnson, I think he believed he had accomplished that goal that he set out back in 1920 when he was 12 years old. He was playing king of the mountain, a kid's game, that's what they do. But he was serious about that. And at this point, Johnson is sitting in his throne chair, that they called it, this big, ornate, huge chair that set up higher in his private quarters in Air Force One. And 4 or 5 reporters were gathered around him. And he went into a little deal where he says, look who's left in the world. Adenauer's gone, Signet's gone, and a few others, I can't remember all of them. Who's left? De Gaulle, he said with a sneer. And then he says, and it was written by this captain of the airplane, Air Force One. He then says, "It's me. I am king of the world." And the way he described it, he bellowed it out at the top of his lungs. "I am king of the world." He won. He won his game. For all the above reasons, Allen Dulles, in my view, is a very unlikely candidate. As horrid an individual as we now know he was nonetheless a tweed-jacketed, pipe-smoking thinker from Princeton, a man who leaned toward introspection and introversion. And I believe he probably had at least the vestiges of a conscience that he had to try to suppress all those years. And that's a whole nother issue. Any charisma Dulles might have had, was rarely observed and would have derived only from the power he held over one agency, even though his tenure with that agency had ended 2 years previously, after he had been fired from it by JFK. He controlled a relative handful of people compared to one of his partners in the crime of the century. It was essential that the driving force behind the assassination would know who could be trusted at the topmost levels of each of these entities, whose own connections were to the right actors in the middle and lower rungs, as trusted as well. That is, who could be trusted. Lyndon Johnson could control any number of men, from pawing a single target's arms as he hovered over him, putting his face within inches of the other person, while using every tool in his massive bag of tricks to persuade or dissuade, threaten or cajole, bribe or simply demand his way. And he could do similar things to many thousands at a time. As president, he would manipulate millions into following him through some of America's most tumultuous and catastrophic years in its 2 centuries of existence, except maybe for the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, and the World Wars. The single most important individual to the enterprise, by definition, had to have been a man whose reach across all government agencies, from the FBI to the Secret Service and stretching across the Potomac to the Pentagon, the intelligence agencies upriver, where Dulles had served, and other law enforcement and judicial entities, whether federal, state, local police, and sheriffs, stretched far, wide, and deep. And my second book is going to go into that in much more detail than even in the first. That is, back to the Texas, how he controlled judges, sheriffs, coroners. He forced them to do as he wanted. It required a driving force, someone like the man Bobby Kennedy once described as the most formidable human being he had ever met, to pull all the independent forces together, to function with unity of purpose under emergency conditions. The urgent purpose, Johnson would doubtlessly remind the others, was the continued survival of the nation. For him and them, as deluded as they were, it was a case of national security. They thought they were being patriots. They convinced themselves of that. And Johnson, I'm going to show over and over again, in the book at least, that is what he could do. He could convince himself of anything. He could take any set of lies and convince himself that they were true. And he could make others believe they were true as well, even the most far-fetched. And they would just accept it and say, okay, that's the deal. If I'm going to still work here in the White House, I better go along with it. It is axiomatic that the driving force could only be someone of a mighty and redoubtable character and a manic temperament. It was Johnson's formidable presence that was essential to bring all the interested parties together. And as powerful as they might have been, neither Angleton, Dulles, Rockefeller, Hoover, Nixon, or anyone else was Johnson's equal in the larger political world where he reigned. Lyndon Johnson had practiced it his entire lifetime and had achieved not only similar connections to the Eastern establishment, specifically with Nelson Rockefeller, among others from that group, but with the sweet 8F crowd in Texas, who were practically begging to handle the financing of the enterprise so they could retain their prized oil depletion allowance. So the answer is none of the above. LBJ, though, he had direct connections into every one of these, or the previous slide, every one of those groups. Somehow that, no, come on. Well, I'll just go back to that. So who could the key man be? You want to call it a key man or a pivot man, whatever you want to call it. Driving force I like, but I've been calling it mastermind, so I think I'll just continue that. Only one man met all of the criteria required for the murder of John F. Kennedy, including being the original creator of the idea, i.e. meeting the dictionary definition of the term mastermind, or my new term, the driving force. Lyndon Johnson, vice president and co-CEO of the military-industrial complex, or if you want to call it invisible government. You can do that. Could Giancana or Marcello, or even Dulles, Angleton, or Hoover have created the cover-up and forced the doctors and military men at Bethesda to do what they did, and then promise them protection through invoking government secrecy protocols? I don't think so. Could Hoover or Dulles, or anyone besides Johnson, have set up that motorcade by taking over all the planning for a month in Texas? He spent a month down there planning all the details of that motorcade. They forced the motorcade route through Dealey Plaza, and they had a lot of help in doing that, of course. But that was the result, even though all of Kennedy's men wanted it at the other venue, at the Women's Building, at the fairgrounds. So they had Pepsi-Cola. Someone had the bright idea of having Pepsi rent that place for their little get-together, sort of at the last minute. That was done within a few weeks, or a couple of weeks, I believe, so that it wouldn't even be available. And Nixon might have had something to do with that. Okay. Could Hoover, well, no, I didn't. Well, let me just finish that. They forced the motorcade route through Dealey Plaza, eliminating security, changing the vehicle sequence, moving the president's doctor and military aides to a bus in the back of the motorcade. Only Dallas that happened. That is, Johnson took this aggressive planning, took on that task. Not in Houston, not in San Antonio, nowhere else, only Dallas. And guess who visited him on his ranch 3 weeks before the assassination? Dulles. LBJ set out in 1958-59 to put himself into the office of Vice President of the United States, not the presidency, because he knew he couldn't risk the loss, either in the primary or the general election, because then he could never run again, and it was he considered it his destiny. It was going to happen one way or the other, in other words. Once he became vice president, he began sabotaging practically every domestic and international initiative advanced by JFK as he collaborated with his associates and other high officials within the military and intelligence organizations of the U.S. government. Between 1961 and 63, as a result of numerous repeated incidents, his relationships with a number of these military and intelligence officials grew greater and tighter, just as JFK's deteriorated, to a point that many of them decided that his presidency presented too many risks to what they perceived as the national security. So who met all of these criteria? Who had the most to gain? Who had the least to lose? Who had the means to do it? Who had the apparatus in place to subsequently cover it up? Who had the kind of narcissistic, sociopathic, demented personality capable of rationalizing the action as acceptable and necessary, together with the resolve and determination to see it through? The key force behind all of the others had to possess the power to set it up, the psyche of a demented sociopath, the mania of a manic depressive, the experience of ordering murders in the past for anyone who got in his way. Because you couldn't just jump into something like this, you had to grow into it, and you start with baby steps. That's should be obvious. Answer, Lyndon B. Johnson. His lifetime obsession was to become president of the United States, as I said before, starting at age 12. He had the least to lose. He was facing possible prison time and the permanent loss of his presidential aspirations. Consider the alternative to Johnson's not taking action: impending indictments, possible prison time, the permanent loss of his presidential aspirations, which he viewed as his divine and inevitable destiny. He faced a choice with enormous consequences. Either proceed with the plan and go to the White House, or drop the plan and go to prison. That's what it comes down to. And he had the means to do it. Johnson had been a friend to many of JFK's enemies, and he could be expected to use his famed Johnson treatment on them to recruit other key men. The conversations he had with his good friend and neighbor of nearly 20 years, J. Edgar Hoover, might have centered on this plan since the point at which he enlisted Hoover to help force Kennedy to accept him as the vice presidential nominee in 1960. His many back channels to the highest officials of the Pentagon, LeMay, Lansdale, Burris, and the CIA, Angleton, Dulles, many of whom were increasingly desirous of replacing JFK as quickly as possible, that would provide him with the devices he would need to execute the plan and its immediate cover-up. The apparatus in place to cover it up. Once he became president, the entire federal government was his to run. All other governmental entities, including individual local office holders, such as Dallas Police Captain Will Fritz and the District Attorney, Henry Wade, were under his control through the basic and natural deference with which people treated the President of the United States. Only Johnson met all the criteria. Only someone whose conduct was unconstrained by his conscience could generate an act as heinous as the murder of a president. He had engaged in numerous crimes during his political career, including his involvement with convicted conman Billy Saul Estes, who implicated Johnson in several murders, in addition to him having had his own hitman, Malcolm Mack Wallace. Johnson managed to corrupt the Texas judicial system such that Wallace was given, incredibly, a 5-year suspended sentence after being found guilty of first-degree murder. Who else could do that? I've never heard of that from anybody. Well, okay. What do we know about Lyndon Johnson's mental issues? The narcissistic, sociopathic, demented, mendacious, psychotic personality. I didn't just make this up. The truth about Lyndon Johnson's lies and deceit and his many sociopathic and psychiatric issues have been confirmed by those who knew him. Robert Caro, in his first book, written when he was establishing himself as an objective, critical historian and biographer, quoted one of Johnson's longtime aides who wanted to remain anonymous, who said, Lyndon had a side to him. He could get very low. When he got real quiet, it was bad. Sometimes very bad. According to author D. Jablo Hirschman in her book, now I forget the title, Beyond Reason or something like that, she wrote that the United States was being led by a man who already was, or rapidly was, becoming psychotic. Most of the LBJ biographies, if they mention his mental condition at all, make notes of his behavior, and treat them like they're merely the eccentricities of a cowboy come politician. Eccentricities. That's it. That's what I'm, thank you. That is what produces the dichotomy I spoke of earlier. There it is, power beyond reason. I think yeah. Signs of grandiosity and paranoia were present before LBJ became president. His grandiosity, megalomania, and paranoia reached dimensions that could no longer pass for normalcy. LBJ's manic furies and incapacitating depressions, his pathological ego, megalomania, and paranoia were products of his manic depression. And that's just one of his ailments, the manic depression. That's one of about half a dozen, which you'll be seeing shortly. Lyndon Johnson was a man possessed and obsessed with his singular goal. He must become president, and once there, he wanted to become what historians would eventually say was the best president ever, which meant that he would have to become a wartime president, just like FDR. Gerald Tolshin, PhD and psychology professor, who didn't write at all about the assassination. I mean, he was simply concentrating, he and his fellow author were simply concentrating on Johnson's psychological side. Said that he was a tragic figure, pursued by demons, real and imagined. It appears likely that Lyndon Johnson suffered from bipolar manic depressive disorder throughout his life, a condition that grew worse as he grew older, peaking just as he reached the zenith of his influence and power. This is the point that many researchers do not factor into the equation. By ignoring this, they continue giving LBJ the benefit of the doubt. Okay, so let's talk a little more about Colossus, the second book. Some people have indicated that they didn't feel I had made the case in the first book, in the Mastermind book. And I believe that, I believe that the second book will make amends for that and make the case even stronger than the first book. Because the first chapter of the new book is devoted entirely to documenting the case that Clint Peoples, the Texas Ranger, worked on really for 40 years. Because he was aware of it in 1951 when Mac Wallace was on trial down there in Austin for that murder that he got off with. And that caused a lot of people to get interested in what was going on there right away. And that stunned the whole city. And you can tell that by looking at the old newspaper articles. It reflected, like, what in the world happened down here? And it lasted until 1991, or 92, when he was forced off the road and basically killed, when one of the Texas styles of killing people. Anyway, what I want to mention first is that the reason these files were not in Mastermind was because they weren't available then. They were not released until 2012. And Mastermind came out early, the first time is 2010, then the 2011, and so forth. And the third edition is 2013. But the point is, I didn't even become aware that the files were finally opened. That is the complete files. The files that pertain to what I'm going to be telling you about Barefoot Sanders. They were the ones I'm referring to. This is Clint Peoples, the Texas Ranger, whose impeccable credentials and long history of law enforcement eventually made him a Texas legend, one of the most honored Rangers in Texas history. Captain Peoples was later made a U.S. Marshal and was a man who received multiple awards over an unblemished lifetime of law enforcement, eventually appearing on the Johnny Carson Tonight Show as a consequence. It is Clint Peoples' unquestioned professionalism that imbues truth to his belief in Billy Saul Estes and Madeline Brown's accounts and injects both with the essential credibility that now demands our attention. Clint Peoples' career ambition and his fight against the political machine of Lyndon Johnson must not be ignored. But you don't hear too much about it, and this is really, because it's relatively new stuff, what I'm covering in the Colossus is very, very comprehensive. It's a chapter that's about probably 30 or 40 pages long, I forget which, but it's pretty detailed and pretty lengthy. I was aware that Roger Stone had added a little bit of information about that in the second edition of his book, but it's only about 6 or 8 pages. It's not nearly the kind of detailed information that I have in Colossus. Johnson historians who still ignore Clint Peoples' story while continuing to ignore Billy Saul Estes' sworn testimony, man, I'm having a hard time talking up here. Historians who still ignore Billy Saul Estes' sworn testimony and Madeline Brown's confessions of her intimate 20-year affair with Johnson have now run out of excuses to do so. They can't just say, most people aren't credible. You got this honored guy with the impeccable credentials that says otherwise. One day the truth would come out. This is Clint Peoples talking. One day the truth will come out. It's going to have to be some changing of the guard in some places, he said cryptically. You have to read between the lines. I feel more relieved now than I've ever felt in my life. That was in 1984, just after he was able to convince the 1984 grand jury that in fact Lyndon Johnson, Cliff Carter, and Mac Wallace were the people who were involved in the murder of Henry Marshall back 22 years before that in 1962. Because he was murdered in 1961. In 1962, they had the first grand jury. And I'll be getting into that, so I don't want to go any further at this point. Another picture of Clint Peoples on his horse, Chico. It was Peoples' unimpeachable 40-year record that must be factored into this metric. To ignore it is to reject arguably the most credible and important witness to the crime of the century. So it'll be interesting to see if it comes out anywhere else. But if it weren't for the fact that he has now done this, then we would just go on and on forever, expecting that it will never be solved because no one's ever going to believe Billy Saul Estes and Madeline Brown. Only by focusing on these events through the eyes of Ranger Captain Clint Peoples can we understand the arc of Johnson's crime spree that Peoples witnessed in real time, beginning in 1951. He saw how Johnson had applied his treatment and manipulated through a combination of threats, intimidation, blackmail, or bribery, the judge, at least one and probably more members of the jury, the defense attorney, and the prosecutor into getting his hitman, Mac Wallace, freed from jail and merely put on probation for 5 years after having been convicted of first-degree murder. That was the murder of Doug Kinzer. The first known murder that Johnson was involved with, but there may have been others before that. These accusations were made by Billy Saul Estes and Madeline Brown, and this was basically just the letter that was involved with that Doug Caddy wrote to the Justice Department in trying to get some immunity for him so that he could testify. This was after he spent all his time in jail. He was done with the jail stuff and out of prison, and he had no other motive for needing to do this He wasn't trying to pull anything. He simply wanted to be protected for whatever he had to say, but no one was interested in hearing him. By the way, this photo here, if you ever go through Dallas at Love Field in the Southwest Terminal, you might see this statue, and that statue was modeled after Clint Peoples. Here's an interesting quote from Clint Peoples. When the undertaker, this is right after Henry Marshall died on this place out in Franklin, Texas, his farm. When the undertaker was told that Henry Marshall committed suicide, quote, he called attention to the justice of the peace and sheriff at Franklin and told them, this man is not a suicide case. This man has been murdered. Told him that his eye was split open, flesh was out of his arms, his hands, his leg, and different things that way. And also that he was banged around so much that there were dents and blood on both sides of his pickup truck sitting out there. And also, he was, Mac Wallace tried to also poison him with carbon monoxide. He had a very high level of carbon monoxide in his body, but he hadn't died yet. So I guess he lost patience, Wallace lost patience and decided just to beat the hell out of it. But they still maintained it was suicide. Now he's referring to the 1962 grand jury where they continued saying it's suicide against this kind of information. But they still maintained it was suicide. So the deeper I got into it, the more I knew it wasn't suicide. The physical evidence on the body was that it was the use of a bolt-action .22 rifle. And in order for Henry Marshall to have killed himself, he had to rebolt that gun every time. Shot 5 times with a long rifle, a .22, in about the size of a 4-inch circle. Also had a lethal dose of carbon monoxide, like I said. The absurdity of a suicide cause of death could not be more clear. To have it stick against all the evidence could have only occurred because of someone who had enormous power over local officials and the arrogance and narcissistic, sociopathic, and brazen general behavior that made it happen. Only LBJ could have done that, and Ranger Peoples knew it. Marshall had to, according to, now this is another photo of the same deal there, the statue. So people said Marshall, now he's talking about Henry Marshall, had to have been murdered as a result of his strong opposition to Billy Saul Estes and the cotton allotment program. That was a millions and millions of dollar program, you know. And he continued. So that was the thing I continuously worked on. And I knew I could never get any of the information out of Billy Saul Estes with what he knew about it. He never talked to anybody before, no, until he talked to me. But he visited, Peoples visited with Estes at the prison. They got to know each other, and they actually got to trust each other. Ranger Peoples was able to get Estes to promise him that when he got out of prison, he would reveal the truth of what happened down there. And that didn't happen until late 1983. And as soon as he did, they got in contact, and then they set up this grand jury in early 1984, and by the end of March of 1984 is when that grand jury finally declared that it was a homicide. They finally figured it out. Unfortunately, all 3 of the people who caused the death, Johnson, Cliff Carter, Mac Wallace, were all dead by then, having died 1971 for the first. I mean, Wallace and Carter died in 1971. Johnson died in 1973, in January, on the anniversary, by the way, of his inauguration 4 years, 8 years earlier. It would have been 4 years earlier had he been reelected. Thank God that didn't happen. Sorry, my bias is showing. Okay. Henry Marshall was blowing the whistle, according to Estes, blowing the whistle to the degree it was going to involve every one of them, and they were all going to the penitentiary. That's what Estes told me. They knew that Henry Marshall had arrangements made, and 2 days before Henry Marshall was killed, I found a letter saying that he was going to Washington. He had a meeting of his people down there in Bryan or somewhere, and he was going to straighten it out the following Monday, but he never made it to Washington. He didn't make it any further than that ranch. Okay, Estes told me that Johnson said, get him promoted, give him a big job in the agriculture department, get him out of there. They tried it, they wrote him letters, he turned them all down, because this is a man who had integrity and principles, and he didn't want to compromise those. I'm just going to skip on to the next. Then Estes said that Johnson said this, he has got to go. And I even made a release to the press that that's the way he told me. He didn't say that Johnson said kill him, assassinate him, or anything like that. He said he's got to go. And those were code words. Johnson always did that. He always said words like that, just he's got to go. And it was just one of those things that you learn, I suppose, when you're a professional criminal and that's all you do, and you do everything in secrecy, and everything is with cloaked in lies and deceit, regardless of those code words. So Johnson could never be accused of actually saying more direct words, like, we've got to kill him. They all meant the same thing to his criminal activities facilitator, Cliff Carter, and his hitman, Malcolm Wallace. These were examples of the covert techniques he had learned at his secret fraternity in college, with which he took over the entire college. And they are techniques he learned from the previous master of manipulation, Johnson's mentor, Alvin Wirtz. To know about Alvin Wirtz, you're going to have to get the book, because I can't go into that. That would take another half hour just to try to explain this guy. But we'll just leave it at this, that Johnson always said he learned more from Alvin Wirtz than any other person ever. And that's where he learned a lot of these secretive processes. Anyway, that 1962 grand jury, it was run by a corrupt sheriff, Howard Stegall, a friend of Cliff Carter and cousin of Johnson aide Glenn Stegall, who appointed a hand-picked jury of his friends and family. Can you believe this? It's a grand jury. The sheriff goes out there and he stacks a jury for one thing. One of them in particular was his son-in-law. And his son-in-law did everything possible. You would not believe the stuff that he did to try to stall the grand jury or try to sabotage it. It was overseen, but all that was overseen by this guy, U.S. Attorney Barefoot Sanders, who censored the evidence presented to the jury, keeping Estes's connections to Johnson from their eyes. And they kept the finding of suicide. Ranger Peoples said, so I called a grand jury and submitted a tremendous amount of evidence to this grand jury. They had some relatives on the grand jury of the sheriff, and so they never could reach an agreement on account of this grand jury influence. They brought the grand jury report down to Franklin. The agriculture report took a good while to get there, and they played Ring Around the Rosie all these years with that report. They censored it in every way they could, and they didn't bring the names out and so forth. And the present federal judge, Barefoot Sanders, now he's a federal judge. By 1984, he went from U.S. attorney to federal judge, and so forth. And the present federal judge, Barefoot Sanders, was a United States attorney in the Northern District of Texas. I didn't know he was down there until after a couple of days it came out in the newspaper. Well, he went on to say, I don't think Barefoot Sanders should have been down there. He should not have been down there. Of course, he is the United States attorney in the Northern District of Texas, but he was down there as the U.S. attorney in the Western District of Texas. So I believe this is merely one of the many times Barefoot Sanders obstructed justice directly on behalf of Lyndon Johnson. The next time, in this case, was 1984. And we're going to be, yeah, okay. So now we're fast forward to 1984. Immediately after the trial started, a 3-judge panel ordered Marshal Peoples to appear before them. Just after the trial started, they were upset with that Clint Peoples was doing his job like he was supposed to be doing, like he was directed to do by the guy he actually worked for, not these folks, these 3-judge panel. That is, he was assigned to investigate a murder case, is the point. So immediately after that trial started, this 3-judge panel ordered Marshal Peoples to come down and appear before them. This is Judges Hal Woodward, Robert Hill, and Barefoot Sanders. Judge Woodward asked him, if the newspapers are bringing out stuff that somebody leaked something to the grand jury, I just wondered if it was you. Of course, that made me pretty furious, and I answered his questions in a very firm manner. I told him, first of all, I didn't appreciate the questions he asked me. They were beyond the call of duty. And he also asked me, when I got here and I found out everybody here knew I was coming, did you tell them? Peoples, responding to that question, continues, in the first place, I didn't know if you were coming or not, and I didn't care if you were coming or not. It had nothing to do with that. I talked right back to him about it because I don't owe him anything. I was going to investigate a murder case, and they're involving themselves in something here that's more or less obstruction of justice. 3 federal judges obstructing justice. They're the ones that should be taken to task for it, but I haven't said anything to the press or anybody else on account that I work here and I want to make the rest of my time here if I can, but every dog will eventually have a chance to wag his tail. On this one, I'm going to wag my tail because this wasn't right. But again, I do want this portion of it closed until my tenure after my tenure here. And so it came to this fellow, Judge Barefoot Sanders, and he came out with some very pointed things. He says to me, running around with old Billy Saul Estes, you opened this case up. You opened this murder case up. You are believing what he said. You did this and you did that. And he says, I'm ashamed of you. And he says, you're not fit to be United States Marshal of the Northern District. I think you ought to resign. When he got through, I said, are you through? He said, yes. Peoples says, I pointed my finger in his face and pointed over to Judge Woodward too. And I said, I want to tell both of you something. If you weren't hiding behind these black robes you got, I'm 73 years old, and I've never been talked to this way in my life. If you weren't hiding behind these black robes, you wouldn't get by with it. And I'm not sure you're going to get by with it anyway. And I turned to Sanders and I said, let me tell you something. I'll put my credibility up against yours any day of the week. And I said another thing, don't you ever again call me in like this and start reprimanding me over something because you are all wrong, as you can be about this and you know it. And don't you ever do this again. Now you're a federal judge and all this, but you went way beyond the call of duty here. And they wouldn't even let me. I had my attaché case with a Billy Saul Estes tape in it, and I had the records. And I was going to show them why I was working on this case. They wouldn't even let me take my attaché case inside the judges' chambers because they thought that maybe I'd be recording what we were saying. And I guess it's one of the biggest blunders I ever did, was not putting a body microphone on when I went in there to talk to these three judges. Okay. U.S. Marshal Peoples continued working that case through the 1980s and early 1990s, discovering that a fingerprint found on the Texas School Book Depository was a match to Malcolm Wallace. So he was the guy who actually first found that 5 years before the other folks down there, Jay Harrison and so forth, came across it. He created an oral history with the Dallas Public Library, including devastating statements about Johnson's criminal past. The most important of these reveal how Barefoot Sanders had intervened numerous times to protect Johnson. we're going to fast forward here to talk about a number of things that he did over a period of many years, well, at least 22 years. So in 1962, he took over censorship of that grand jury to keep the suicide verdict, an absurd result that should not have stood. But for the fact that there was so much hiding and so forth, and obstruction of justice, again, by the justice people. In 1963, he assisted Johnson in securing the trademark as venue and therefore setting the motorcade route. Also, he classified the murder as a, quote, local crime, because you remember that's the way it was classified at first, when they wanted to keep it there under the jurisdiction of all these local people that he had control over. But eventually they figured out that wasn't going to work, so they had to expand it. In 1964, Sanders inserted himself again on Johnson's behalf to help guide the Warren Commission proceedings when he volunteered his censorship expertise again. Sanders also intervened do I get an echo there? Sanders also intervened to put a halt to the sharing of Warren Commission interviews as previously agreed. It was an agreement that they had with the Texas Attorney General, who complained to General Counsel Lee Rankin that 90 such Texas interviews were conducted, but none were shared. They had the agreement. Where were they? Rankin's response was that, quote, the ground rules of the joint investigation had been set aside by then U.S. Attorney Barefoot Sanders. According to Penn Jones, Jr., and forgive my grief, this was done to impede the ability of the deposed witnesses to review the prepared statements in order to keep them from finding out that their statements had been altered. And you've probably read yourselves many cases where people who had been deposed found out 20 or 30 years later that that's not what they said. I don't know how many times I read that, but quite a few. And it happened again also in the other assassinations. So in 1965-66, Sanders took control over the Jack Ruby trial. Another 18 reports were given to Sanders by the FBI, and he and his assistant Herbert Miller censored them. One such deletion, they removed the records of the Bank of Dallas with regard to Ruby's finances. He also decided which witnesses would appear and which would not, and we know what that means. 1967, now an assistant attorney general working for Ramsey Clark at the Justice Department in Washington, he was the key to the manipulation of the forensic evidence held by the National Archives. I go into great detail on how that happened. That's how all that, the autopsy evidence, the photos and the x-rays and so forth, got switched around. It was Barefoot Sanders, again, coming to the rescue of Johnson. 1984, now a federal judge in Dallas, he tried to derail the new grand jury probing Marshall's death, but for the fact that they had a guy, Clint Peoples, who is now no longer a ranger. Now he's a U.S. Marshal. And that's when that conflict happened. He was a U.S. Marshal. And if it hadn't been for him standing up to this guy, anybody else would have just folded, and that would have been the end of that. So here we are in 1992. I mentioned before that Peoples died in a one-car accident, supposedly, but he was actually run off the road by a big red truck and into a culvert. But let's step back a second. Back in 1984, Peoples had said this: before I die, there will be one of the most jarring international scandals that has ever been as a result of this investigation. A lot of people take the position, oh, well, he's already dead, or, well, they are already out of office. The hell with that. Those people that got by with that need to be, if they're dead now, they still need to be exposed as a deterrent against future things like this. Now, that statement sat in the closed files all the way up to 2 years ago. That was not released until 2012, along with all these other assertions about what happened down there with Barefoot Sanders. But sometime after that, he changed his mind. And the reason he changed his mind was because he was afraid that if he went ahead and let them open those files while he was still alive. Remember he said, before I die, there's going to be this in it? Well, he changed his mind because he knew that if Barefoot Sanders had any way to get hold of those papers, they would disappear. He knew that. So he changed the terms of the Dallas Public Library to a whole different deal. They had to wait until he died, his wife died, and his daughter died. And by doing that, it delayed until 2012, when his daughter died, the release of those files. In the meantime, just 5 years before that, is when Barefoot Sanders finally croaked. Johnson's proteges make news. These scandals made headlines in newspapers during 1962 and 63, even appearing as cover stories in magazines. But Billy Saul Estes and the worst crimes of Bobby Baker are ignored by all major biographers of Lyndon Johnson. The fact that the much heralded historians and biographers, to a man and at least one woman, ignore his crimes is itself a crime against the basic principles of journalistic integrity and the presumption of the honesty of historians. Is there no such canon of ethics applicable to them that would require historians to properly include the bad with the good and not join the circle, the wagons mentality behind protecting the worst crimes imaginable in order to perpetuate the myth of greatness for someone who is, as pathetically deluded as Lyndon Johnson? There are at least public expectations of ethical behavior among all professionals, regardless of profession, and whether there exists an official canon or code that delineates every single potential possibility. For example, NFL coaches have an intrinsic duty to not protect their star players from punishment for violent criminal behavior. Should not journalists, historians, biographers be subject to their own implicit ethical guidelines? The Texas Ranger who diligently pursued his chief criminal for 4 decades was one of the few heroes in the sordid story, and that was because he had remained faithful to his implicit ethical code. Okay. Treason number 2. 6 weeks after becoming president, in early January 1964, Johnson ordered George Bundy, to begin planning a series of provocations on North Vietnam to lure them into attacking his own ships, which they purportedly did in August 1964, just coincidentally before the presidential election. Here's another short reading from Colossus. Johnson's puerile worldview and superficial thinking aptitude were described by Philip Galen in his 1966 book, Lyndon B. Johnson and the World. Galen said that Johnson's skills of persuasion work even when it isn't convincing. As examples, he noted how Johnson was able to reassure Senator Gruening, Alaska, that U.S. troops would begin to be withdrawn by the early part of 1966. It was about the same time that this occurred in 1965. He told another senator with a keen interest in foreign affairs that, quote, if we don't stop the Reds in South Vietnam, tomorrow they'll be in Hawaii, and next week they'll be in San Francisco. That's the kind of genius the fellow guy. I mean, it's pathetic, considering the man that he replaced as president, from that to this. Okay, here's a slide, thanks to Alan Kent. Yes, Alan Kent, right? I'm sorry. I'll just read this if you can't read it. False flag defined, a horrific staged event blamed on a political enemy and used as a pretext to start a war or enact draconian laws in the name of national security. So previously, just for reference, we have 1898, remember the Maine, that was a false flag. 1941, remember Pearl Harbor, another false flag. That is, our military and President Roosevelt knew that that was going to happen. That's why there were no aircraft, valuable aircraft carriers in Pearl Harbor. They were all old, surplus World War II battleships. Lyndon B. Johnson's presidential years, the new style from JFK. So the day after the murder, he has a cabinet meeting, and he goes in there and says, I've never been happy with our operations in Vietnam. I'm sure they all knew that anyway. There have been serious dissension and divisions between the cabinet members that must be cleaned up. Furthermore, he declared that there would be no more divisions of opinion. In other words, everybody's got to agree with him. And if you don't, you're out. No more bickering, and any person that did not conform to this policy should be removed. Johnson, yes men need only apply. So how do you interpret all this? In my opinion, it clearly means that he knew that he would be swerving the country into a war that many of these same men, most of them did favor it apparently, but who knows, because they knew that they had to, because if they didn't, they would have to go back to Kansas or Alaska, whatever. How can one interpret that clearly it was his attempt at thinning the herd by making them understand in advance that Johnson would not be a panty waist like the lately departed JFK, that he means business, literally. Tough guy, right? In actuality, he was a physical coward, and I've covered that pretty thoroughly too. So the point is, no mavericks. You got to toe the, line, the Johnson line. And here again, he had proclaimed himself during this period as king of the world. Here's Arthur Goldberg. I'm just going to go through these pretty quickly. Kennedy didn't mind disagreement. It didn't bother him. But this disagreement really bothers LBJ. He's going to do what you dislike anyway, so let's not upset him by having an argument in front of him. Dean Rusk. At most cabinet meetings, Lyndon Johnson asked Bob McNamara and me to comment on Vietnam, and then he would go around the table asking each cabinet officer, do you have any questions or comments? Everyone sat silently, says Dean Rusk. Richard Goodwin. Johnson would begin cabinet meetings with the question, what are you doing here? Why aren't you out there fighting against my enemies? Don't you realize that if they destroy me, they'll destroy you as well? Questions about Vietnam were discouraged, and if asked, went unanswered. George Reedy. The cabinet discussions were very gentlemanly and were really monologues in which one man is getting of what he sends out. So the end of the line, I have this in here because I'm closing out the Vietnam segment here, and I didn't go into a lot of stuff about Vietnam per se, but I went into, what caused us to somehow be there. And I'm going to just skip right through this too, even just keep on track here, to get to treason number 3, because I know that's news to a lot of people, and it's going to be news to the people who read Colossus, because I've spent, I think about, well, actually, 2 chapters, not just 1, but 2 full chapters, and they're pretty lengthy chapters, something like 30 pages each. It's about creating another false flag attack on his own ship, the USS Liberty, by Israel. In other words, he forced Israel. In my opinion, I think I've demonstrated it pretty thoroughly here, that for the purpose of blaming Egypt and President Nasser of Egypt, to show Jewish supporters how he would go to war on the side of Israel against Egypt, Syria, Jordan, and the USSR, and basically invite World War III in order to do so. And it was for what? Because he thought he would get political payback, okay? And somehow he would have all of those young Jewish people across Lafayette Park stop doing that demonstrating stuff against Vietnam, and shut up those awful words, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today, by doing this. Well, here's what's left of their legacies. I'm not sure if you can read that, so I'll do it real quickly. In honor of the crew of the USS Liberty, in recognition of their courageous and faithful service for military action on June 8, 1967, the following decorations were awarded: 38 silver and bronze stars, 208 Purple Hearts, and it was really more than, well, the Congressional Medal of Honor went to the captain of it. There's a, let me just read what I've prepared here. In the annals of U.S. military history, there are no doubt many unsolved and perplexing mysteries, but few could compare to the fate of the U.S. Navy spy ship that was mercilessly attacked by one of its closest allies, intentionally and without warning. One of the reasons it is still a mystery is because it is also the only peacetime attack on a U.S. naval vessel that to this day has never been investigated by the Congress of the United States, if you can believe that. There is much more to this story, and we'll summarize it, and it's got to be superficial because we're running out of time. So we'll just go as quickly as we can. The unsolved mystery was a case of an unparalleled deception, placing the blame on Israel to save the president who created the false flag attack and the resulting 5 decades of subordinating U.S. interests to Israeli blackmail. There are 2 chapters focused on that, as I said before. In my opinion, I think I have shown that LBJ was behind this unparalleled deception, and that when the ship was attacked, well, let me just follow this. This will work out better. May 23rd, 1967, the ship was undergoing repairs in Abidjan, Ivory Coast. And that is down there. They got an order from the JCS took control, complete control of a very unusual deal. The Joint Chiefs took control, direct control of that ship. It should have been, it was part of the 6th Fleet. But they ordered it up at full speed around the Cape of Africa, all the way around there and then back over here. 6,000 miles, full speed. One stop in Rota, Spain. They picked up a couple of more linguists and supplies and whatnot. And then they moved on at 2,300 miles against 30 and 40 mile per hour winds in order to get there. And so here they are rushing pell-mell up to get there, and they finally get there 2 weeks later, and just that evening, or the following morning, after they're in place, let's go to the next slide. This shows the tracking. At 6:30, talking about 6:30 a.m., and then you track down there, that's where the attack was. By the way, that fast trip up around there, the 6,000 miles, the unusual haste and the stern, urgent demeanor of the shore patrolmen who were sent out in Abidjan to collect all the sailors and find them in their bars or wherever they were, in their hotels, and get them down there. This was all contributing to the tenseness that all of these sailors felt. They knew there was something very dangerous ahead. They had no idea. They had no idea because they didn't realize they had a lunatic for the president. Strangely, after this 2-week frenetic effort to get the ship in position, on the evening of June 7th, when they finally reached their destination 13 miles off the coast of Gaza, they found that other ships, including another spy ship, the USNS, Private Jose Valdez, had been simultaneously ordered to leave the area. In fact, except for the Liberty and the reported sighting of an American submarine or more, possibly who knows how many, nearby, all U.S. ships were ordered to remain 100 miles offshore. That order was supposedly intended for the Liberty as well, but for other mysterious reasons, it was never received by the ship. On a beautiful sunny day, as the Liberty sailed along at 5 knots, 13 miles off the Sinai, with its flag flapping in the breeze, It was mercilessly attacked by Israeli jets with 30-millimeter cannons, rockets, and napalm. The attack came at 2 p.m. Sinai time, 8 a.m. in Washington on June 8, 1967, after 11 to 13 overflights to identify and monitor the Liberty. There is no question, according to the survivors and every one of the U.S. Navy officers who ever investigated it, that Israel knew exactly what that ship was. And even some people, some military men from the Israeli Navy and Air Force even admitted that. They knew that it was a U.S. ship. The official record stated that the 3 Mirage fighter jets that attacked the ship were unmarked. However, one of the survivors claimed that he had seen a Star of David insignia on one of the Mirages. The first attack came as a complete surprise to the crewmen, some of whom were sunbathing on the top deck, and was targeted to taking out gun mounts, the ship's antenna, the bridge with heat-seeking missiles. Just before the attack, the 5 radio frequencies used by the Liberty were jammed by the attackers, as well as the international distress frequency used for Mayday messages, a fact that proved conclusively that the Israeli High Command knew precisely which ship that they were attacking. By destroying the radio antenna on the deck, they intended to eliminate the ship's ability to immediately call for help. The initial attack killed about 10 men who were on the top deck, leaving only piles of body parts strewn about the deck. This was followed by a secondary attack by 3 torpedo boats, which were flying the Israeli Star of David flag, using cannons, 50 caliber machine guns, and torpedoes. The ship managed to outmaneuver 4 torpedoes, but the 5th could not be avoided. It left a 22-foot by 39-foot hole in the starboard side that should have sunk the ship. It was only because where it struck, it hit the structural member of the ship, and that stopped the torpedo from going further. I mean, it did create this hole, this huge hole, but it didn't sink. Anyway, this is even worse. Gunboats then circled the wounded Liberty, firing at crewmen who were trying to fight the fires and strafing the lifeboats that were filling with sailors who had been ordered to abandon ship, sinking 2 of them and destroying the lifeboats, and destroying the non-deployed rest with gunfire. Intentional destruction of the lifeboats was contrary to international rules of engagement for any reason and for any eventuality. For the following hour and a half, the Liberty sailors fought to keep the ship afloat and avoid being shot at by the Israeli gunboats, with its radio technicians scrambled to fix the communication equipment in order to call for help. How are we doing? Okay. Okay. I'm going to just cut through some of this then, because we only have 5 minutes left. I apologize for that, and it seems like I can never get my timing down. Well, okay, here's a comparison. Here's the ship before the attack and after the attack. It's listing on the starboard side. What they were expecting to be able to go to port in Crete, which would have been just a few hours away, but they were not able to do that. They were ordered to sail that ship in that condition with a huge hole in it, and it was just a question of whether it was going to sink. If the seawater kept going in, cold seawater against the, well, if it got through the what do you call the interior bulkhead? If it got through there, it hit the boiler, it would blow the whole ship up. And that's what somebody is apparently hoping would happen, because they made them sail that ship across to Malta. Malta, yeah, it was a week. They had to sail that ship a week over the deepest, most choppiest water of the Caribbean. the Mediterranean. It's just unbelievable. You have to read the book. I'm sorry I'm running out of time, but it's an incredible story that was a secret. Johnson invoked the secrecy rules again on that, and he kept it a secret for 12 years before anybody, because they were ordered. They said, you cannot ever talk about this, or you'll face court-martial or worse. What is worse than court-martial? Okay, here's something that I'm just going to let you see, and then I'm being told I got to speed it up here. But let me just read this piece here. In other chapters of Colossus, we explore the death of Martin Luther King, the death of James Forrestal, who was the first Secretary of Defense in 1949, a very suspicious situation that'll leave your mind boggled too, and Johnson's role in that, by the way. The deaths of reporters and an attorney connected to Jack Ruby, Jim Cothey, Tom Howard, Bill Hunter, the suicide, quote unquote, of Grant Stockdale, the 1964 murder of Mary Meyer, the strange deaths of Cliff Carter, Mac Wallace, LBJ's cousin J. Burt Pack, the murdering mortician John M. Liggett, Dallas policeman and CIA operative Roscoe White, the murder of Mary Sherman, of whom you will hear more about tomorrow. Well, anyway, and finally the death of George DeMornchield. So I apologize for running so short on time, but look at this though. So after Bobby was shot in Los Angeles, just after midnight on June 5th, all day long, Bobby hung in there. He didn't die for another day. All day long. Johnson is quoted by Joseph Califano, one of his cabinet members, and other people have also affirmed this. All he would say is he dead? Is he dead yet? Is he dead? All day long, this is going on. And his own aides were wondering why would he be doing it? Instead of saying, you know, is he going to make it? No, is he dead yet? Yeah, that was our president there. Okay, sorry.
Great presentation, Phil.